everybody. Reporting to you again from the Glamour City, Hollywood.
Is to make sure that, you pause and think about, these are the ways this could go wrong. Let me make sure before I go further ahead, I am making sure that technology cannot be used for bad, or it's not going to go rogue on its own. Having that discussion and saying, how are you thinking about fairness? What kind of data sets have you trained on? Having that basic fluency will empower every employee to actually think ahead and ask those questions to any sources that they might be getting their APIs or, actual solutions, products that they're buying. Today, that does not happen.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. I'm joined by Beena Ammanath, Executive Director of Global Deloitte AI Institute and founder of Humans for AI. Welcome to the show today.
Thank you so much for having me, Scott.
So when we think about the notion of trustworthy AI, it embodies actually a lot of different facets, right? So things like ethical, fair, and impartial, as well as robust, reliable, to really looking at privacy holistically, as well as the security side, as well as being responsible, accountable, and transparent and explainable. When we think about all these different facets, how do we start to reconcile all of these different things? And is it truly feasible to achieve all of them? Or is some things maybe more or less realistic?
Yeah, no, that's a great question to start with, Scott, because, there are many dimensions to trust, right? And, really thinking about it from a business specific, from a context specific is the key part of it, because each one of those dimensions can mean different things depending on where the AI is being used and how it is being used. For example, you pick up fairness, right? There is not one universal definition for it. And at the same time, it might mean different things in different contexts. For example, if you are using an AI solution to predict a large equipment failure, right? Fairness may not be a dimension that comes under your trustworthy umbrella, but it might be more about reliability and safety and security, as opposed to fairness or bias within the algorithm. So it really depends on the use case, the context specific, and that's the nuance that trustworthiness needs to make it real in the real world.
So we're going to get into this in a lot more depth, but what comes to mind is essentially kind of a checklist or a composite scoring where you have all these different facets and you're basically able to score against it. But basically what you're saying is, depending on the use case, the industry application, and who's using it and in what context, that checklist is going to vary and the spectrum is going to be pretty wide. So really the composition of those things could vary pretty drastically from one use case to one organization to another. Which brings up another question, is the notion of trust and ethics. It means different things to different people. You alluded to that. So you have things like culture, you have things like religion, and one group may feel that that's ethical, whereas another group may feel that same principle may be unethical. So how do we reconcile this notion of ethics across cultures, boundaries, organization, but more interestingly, the dimension of time? Because when we think about our value system, it changes over time. So what is considered good or bad in the past may not hold true today or in the future, for instance.
This is such a deep question, Scott, and I'll try my best to answer it. And the way I approach it is very much focusing from a business and organizational perspective. The reason being that most of AI that is being built or being used and scaled is by businesses, right? By organizations. So how do we put that ethics lens more from an organizational perspective? Because you're absolutely right. Depending, your personal ethics will be very different from my personal ethics and beliefs because it's based on my background, right? And your background. So how do you, but at an organizational level, at a business level, you need to align behind a few core principles that's important for your organization. And that's the starting point to start getting your arms around ethics and move it from a philosophical debate to actual impact in the real world. So I don't think it is going to be a one size fits all. We can never solve for AI ethics if we stay at this high level and think at individual level. And that's not the goal. It's like every company has their core values, core commitments that they align behind. How do you make sure AI ethics is part of those core values and every employee is aligned with it as long as they're part of the organization? That's one way to solve for it.
So I wonder, analogous is going to be something like say the assurance practice or auditing, for instance, where the auditors, external auditors, are not necessarily trying to evaluate the values of a process or policy, but rather based on the stated policy of an organization, their job is to assure and attest that they're holding to what they say they're going to do. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And that because there are already processes in place, there's controls in place. And the best way we can get our arms around this and tackle this head on before it gets to be an even bigger challenge is to leverage existing processes, governance controls, that the things that have worked for several years. How do you make sure AI ethics is embedded within those processes and extend it out to include AI ethics?
So when we think about, let's say, publicly traded companies that have to provide quarterly results and earnings reports and auditor reports, and now, of course, we're adding additional dimensions like carbon accounting. Now there's a dimension of AI ethics as well that could be potentially added to the evaluation of a company, for instance. But in that regard, how do we balance this notion of, yes, it's organizational specific, but do we have or can we have a universal definition of AI ethics that everyone can buy into?
I think that will be very hard to do. And that's been the struggle for the past few years, right? We hear these very catchy headlines and, but really to be solved for it, it needs to go down to that next level of depth. You think about, say, for, even at a industry specific level, it'll be hard. Forget about universal, but you think about healthcare, right? And privacy is super important. Fairness and bias is super important. When you think about AI ethics implications in healthcare, that's what comes to mind. But reality is even within healthcare, there are different ways and different scenarios when AI is being used. If you're using AI to predict an X-ray machine failure so that you can proactively call a technician to fix it, you probably, that's not going to be a scenario where you need to worry about fairness and bias or privacy, right? But if you're looking at it from a patient care perspective, privacy is super important. So I think it is, the reality is slowly coming in that to actually, solve for AI ethics, you need to go down to that level of depth to make it into a tangible problem statement that you can solve for.
I think that's an excellent point that you make. And this really goes to even really just AI in general, is when we're developing machine learning, neural nets, deep network. It's not about the techniques. It's not about the statistics or Bayesian approach or clustering. It's about the specific use case and the application. So it's this notion of associating or correlating those value system with the specific use case and the actors or the users that are involved in that. I think that's a really valuable practical advice that you're providing.
Yes. So if I may add to it, I was just going to say, unlike any other technology, whether you look at cloud or any of the other technologies we've seen so far scaling out, right? AI is really about, encapsulating parts of our intelligence, right? Parts of things that humans would do with our mental power. So bias and bias is going to be natural, but it shouldn't stop us from from making progress with AI completely. AI is going to be different. It can be the exact same library, the exact same algorithm, like you said, but it depends on the training data. It depends on the use case it's solving for.
I think what you're really alluding to, aside from this specificity, is this notion that aside from the lots of jargons around the transparency and removing bias and making it more fair that we hear about, is this notion of security and safety, right? And I wonder, as we look to coalesce different organizations, both private as well as public, into instituting some sort of trustworthy AI, I wonder how other actors, let's say state actors or criminal networks and others who choose not to play by the book. In other words, I mean, it doesn't matter that we try to have some sort of a framework if at some point you have bad actors that's going to always try to use AI for evil and personal gain.
Yes. And, and technology is not good or bad by itself. It depends on who is using it, right? I don't think that technologists, when they're building that technology, are, really thinking about all the ways it could go wrong or, the bad things that can happen as engineers. And I'm a trained engineer. We focus very much on the value creation, all the cool things technology can do. And to make sure that, we are thinking about trustworthy AI or trustworthy technology, you have to think about what are the ways this could go wrong and proactively put in those guardrails. Spend, even if it's just 10% of your whole project management process, spend some time to proactively think beyond value creation to what are the ways this could go wrong. And let's make sure that there are guardrails in place to prevent bad actors from making it rogue.
So I rarely bring this up in public, but I was at a event where I facilitated a conversation with some very senior scientists, researchers, and entrepreneurs. And one of them happened to be focusing on something, I'll try to keep it as broad-based as possible, but around brain-computer interface. And the position that he had at that time was very interesting because he was very agnostic. And he admitted to the group that he had state actors, vast state actors that had contacted him to see if they could actually have access to his hardware and software. So in other words, to your point is that many times when we think about AI and the development and advancement of AI, it's scientists, it's researchers and engineers that are working on ways to have incremental gain or innovation that's going to improve a particular technique or an outcome. But rarely does it actually cross their mind as they're thinking about the research or their papers, the ways those technologies could be misused to develop or do something bad. So you mentioned processes. How do we put that into a scientific framework?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I'm reminded of this line from Jurassic Park, just because your scientists could, they did without, I'm paraphrasing it here a little bit, but, they did without thinking about the consequences. And I think it's almost like, we need to modify the process. I talk from the business context, but even from the research and scientific community, there needs to be a checkpoint in there to really make them think about what are the ways this could go wrong? What are all the possible negative scenarios? And at the end of the day, it is really up to their own values, right? They might choose, but the more we can embed it within the process where there's a checkpoint to think about it, to document for it. And the reality is, Scott, any human being can think of only so many possible scenarios.
Exactly.
The starting point is to think about it, right? We have gone too long focused just on ROI and value creation and the cool, shiny effect feeling. We need to, we have too much power when we build these technologies, right? So we have to take a pause, and it should be part of your natural thinking, and the best ways to do with the process is to make sure that, you pause and think about, these are the ways this could go wrong. Let me make sure before I go further ahead, I am making sure that that technology cannot be used for bad, or it's not going to go rogue on its own.
So again, I kind of agree with you from a pragmatic approach. It's just that when you talk about PhD candidates or associate professors or tenure professors or postdocs, they're so focused and they're already time and resource constrained already. And of course, their fellowships or grants and the financial support is time limited as well. So how realistic is it for them to pause to think about the various possibilities that could happen? Or should we look to either an internal process or an external process where their job is to basically scrutinize things before they become public domain? So for example, in implementation, it becomes available for download, and anybody can start to do, fake AI, whatever it is, and apply it in ways that really wasn't intended to begin with.
There's a lot of work going on in the AI ethics research space from the scientific and academic community. An easy approach is to, team that together, right? So that there is a natural check and balance in place, because I hear you. I mean, when you start thinking about the pressure to deliver on cutting edge innovation, it is really hard. And it seems like an impediment, but in the long run, we know that needs to be done. So I think, pairing up AI ethics researchers with the core AI researchers who are focusing more on the value creation, on building new algorithms, I think that is an easy way. And this is really up to the tenured professors, the leadership, to really make it part, or the universities themselves, to make it part of their core beliefs and make it part of the process before accepting these projects.
I can agree with you more. And that brings me to really a follow-up question, which is this notion of, generally industry people, we like to self-regulate. We don't want the government telling us what to do. So it should be industry-led, consortium-led, alliance-led. So with that said, from your perspective, what's the right balance or formulation between legislation and regulatory framework versus self-regulation, so that the industry efforts and the kinds of challenges that we're talking about here can actually be realistically and practically implemented?
Yeah, and I think this is one of those scenarios where, we're still building the car and driving it on the roads while the speed limits are still being set or the seat belts are still being invented, right? So we are very interesting time where the regulations don't really exist. Over time, I do think there will be regulations, but to your point, it will not cover every possible scenario, and it will be a learning process. So I think there is a fine balance between industries taking the lead and self-regulating or self-governing. And for them to, self-govern, the first step is to define, what does ethics mean for my company, for my business? What are the guardrails I want to put in place for my team so that they can innovate faster, so that they can run faster? So it's going to be a balancing act for the next few years till we have regulations, but over time, there will still be a big component, which is self-regulation. The good news is that as there is more awareness raised, we will see more and more best practices coming into play. We will hear more and more of, how a large healthcare company is addressing, some of the ethical challenges that the smaller healthcare startups can learn from, right? They don't have to, put in that much effort to come up to speed. So there will be playbooks and best practices that come in from the industry and from organizations. And in parallel, we're going to see regulations coming in as well.
And that's a good launching point to talk about your book. We've kind of alluded to a lot of the aspects of your book, but I want to give you the opportunity to give us a kind of a big picture view of the book, and the specific things that maybe there are some takeaways, as well as very concrete examples of how trustworthy AI is being implemented.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Scott. So my book is really focused from a business lens. It is a business guide to, operationalizing AI ethics and trust in your organization. And it is not meant to influence and shape your personal beliefs or ethics. It is for any company to use that as a starting point to define what does AI ethics principles look like for their organization. And then we have use cases and, lots of questions you can ask yourself as you define which dimensions are important for you. Is fairness really important? And what does that mean? And then some of the tricky things you need to figure out, right? Like if you're using a specific technology and it is biased because it's not trained on all possible data sets, but it's still improving performance or increasing your value, should you continue with it, or should we stop? So having questions as a way to discuss and identify those ethics principles, and also identifying what are the process changes that you need to make within your organization. It also provides tips on how do you make sure every employee within your organization understands AI ethics principles and what it means for for your company. Because it's not just the data scientists who should care about AI ethics, it's also that marketing person who might be looking at an AI-driven tool for personalized marketing, who should know what does that AI, trustworthy AI mean for my company, and am I asking the right questions from this vendor? So it's targeted, my suggestion is, you need every employee empowered, and then changing those processes, and then really, how do you make sure you are mitigating some of the risks that come along with not thinking about AI ethics, defining those. And use cases, my background, Scott, is across a variety of industries. And I know that the same technology can be used differently in different scenarios, and the ethical implications, the trustworthy implications are different. Facial recognition, for example, as a technology used in a law enforcement scenario, is a terrible thing if it's biased, right? It should not be used. But if it's being used to drive more worker safety, right? That's a decision that the company needs to make. Should we use facial recognition, even though it is not, we are not sure we've trained it in all possible data sets, but it's increasing our safety by 80%, right? And that becomes a business stakeholder decision to make. So, going through real life scenarios and prompting with questions to then arrive at those decisions on what ethics principles, how do you operationalize it within my business? That's the synthesis of the book.
Well, I think a couple of questions come to mind. One is certainly the book is relevant for just about everyone within an organization. However, there's got to be an executive leader who is beyond a stakeholder that has to drive this through the organization. Does that start at the chief legal officer level? I mean, certainly the CEO, yes. Sure. But who is the right leader that should be spearheading this effort?
Yes, that's a great question. And, it's one of the things that I address in the book as well is, right, once you start going down this journey of trustworthy AI, you need to decide what's the people part of it. Learning and development is a big part, but is there a need for a chief AI ethics officer? Where does that role sit? How do you make sure that role is empowered enough to make decisions? Does it sit within your legal department? Does it sit within your compliance, or is it part of the technology department? And next step is, how do you need, if you don't need a chief AI ethics officer, do you need an ethics advisory board or council of some sort? Because there is so much happening in the academia space, that you need to be aware of, in the regulation space, right? So how do you make sure you are tapped into all the different things that's accelerating in the AI ethics space so that you are bringing it all together to the company? It can be a single role, it can be a group, it can be a committee. And those are all scenarios that different companies are using in the world today. And it really comes to the board and the C-suite to make that decision on which path they want to take.
So I really like the fact that your book helps to spur different stakeholders within an organization to systematically question and inquiry and introspectively think through all these complexities. But at some point, and you called it a couple of times, is this notion of, from a business metric, how helpful is it versus the kind of potential ethical implication? And this kind of gray area, it's not either or, but rather it's kind of a balance, and it's a lever effect. So yes, it has some potential bias, but it's producing so much benefit for the business that should we continue? How do we think about that in a way that makes not only sense, but that still falls within the holistic, trustworthy AI framework?
Yeah, no, that's another great question. And, my hope is that at least this book can serve as a guide to have that starting discussion. We pass too much of, technology's negative impacts as unintended consequences. Let's remove that. Let's have a mindful, thoughtful discussion where every stakeholder knows the value created and the negative impacts, and it's a conscious decision to proceed. It's not an unintended consequences that catches any company by surprise, right? And to your point, there is legal risk, there is ethical risk, there is, financial risk. If you don't look at it, brand and reputation risk comes into play as well. So before you go too down the path of scaling AI, or if you are well ahead of it, you still need to think about trustworthy AI and put those guardrails in place today.
Now, one practical question and then one forward-looking question. So the practical question is, many times the corporate organizations or even public entities for that matter are really consumers of APIs. So in other words, they don't necessarily have visibility into the techniques, tools, or even the data set to some extent. They're just simply consuming. In that regard, as a consumer, what is both the responsibility, but without the granular visibility, how do they make some of these decisions?
These are such great questions, Scott. So and that's why I talk about the fluency, why every employee should be empowered, because there is an employee who's making a decision to engage with the vendor or to use a specific API. That employee should be empowered with a list of questions they should ask. So if your company has AI ethics principles defined and every employee is educated on it, they need to make sure before they use any API that their source aligns behind those same principles. So that before they go down the path, if it's a vendor where you're buying an AI solution from, having that discussion and saying, how are you thinking about fairness? What kind of data sets have you trained on? Having that basic fluency will empower every employee to actually think ahead and ask those questions to any sources that they might be getting their APIs or actual solutions, products that they're buying. Today, that does not happen. Right. Today, it is very focused on just the engineering teams and IT teams. And I truly believe that for a company to succeed on this journey, they need to empower every employee on the ethical principles that they believe in so that they are communicating the same thing to the external vendors.
I think as you're speaking, it makes it very clear to me that most companies have done a pretty good job of outlining their values and mission statement, for instance. So to me, some of the work that you're talking about is an extension, natural extension, derivative of the bigger value systems and principles by which they hold themselves accountable to, including climate and the environment, for instance. My final question is regarding a little bit more obscure, forward-looking, perhaps maybe even esoteric, is that as things like RPAs or robotic process automation evolves and matures to become more intelligent, true intelligent automation, where machines are not simply providing decision support and intelligence, but then begin to actually autonomously transact and make decisions on their own. So in theory, future organizations, let's say a C Corp, could entirely be made up of AI agents and automation, including neural nets and deep networks, that runs every function of an organization. At that time, how do we begin to hold machines, algorithms, and models accountable for the actions that they make?
Yeah, I actually have an entire chapter on accountability. And it doesn't go into this extreme scenario that you just painted, but it's really about, if at the end of the day, the funds are coming from somewhere, right? If you're funding a project, it's important to think upfront who is accountable for it, because we don't currently have regulations around RPA and autonomous decisions, but it is a human who has funded it or built it. So, and this is happening in the real world today, even without that extreme scenario. Defining upfront who will be accountable for it, who goes to jail or who goes and faces the Senate hearing, who is accountable for it, and that right now needs to be a human. And trust me, Scott, when you have a name associated with it, it comes with a lot of responsibility, and you see more thought put into the implications of it. So accountability is a crucial part. Is it the data scientist who built that autonomous system? Is it the software engineer? Is it the IT manager? Is it the CIO? Is it the CEO? Is it the board member? So thinking upfront about who is accountable for that system at the end of the day is a crucial factor.
Well, we're out of time, but I think a kind of departing thought that I have is, as we get into Web3 and decentralized and distributed internet evolution, where potentially you not only have crowdsourced development, but really no one person becomes accountable because everyone is involved in some way and it's fully distributed, it really raises some pretty big questions as well. So with that, I have been joined by Beena Ammanath, Executive Director of Global Deloitte AI Institute and founder of Humans for AI. Thank you for joining the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.